Hi, I'm Meredith Rosen from Meredith Rosen Gallery. Rosen Gallery, New York City. Thank you for joining us on the occasion of Theo Trianopoulos' first solo online exhibition, Ritual Nature is Healing. I first want to introduce Theo Trianopoulos. He's joining us from Los Angeles. He's an artist who builds virtual spaces and interfaces for the human body to inhabit them. He was born in Greece in 1988 and holds an MFA from UCLA. He's shown work at the Hammer and museums in Dusseldorf, like NRW. He was part of the Hyper Pavilion in 2017, which was during the Venice Biennale. And most recently, he produced a mixed reality performance commissioned by the Onassis Foundation at the Sundance Film Festival. Then thank you, Mary Spirito, for joining us from Istanbul. She is the executive director and curator of Proto Cinema, a site-aware cross-cultural art organization. They've been commissioning and presenting exhibitions all around the world since 2011. She's curated many public talks, including tons for Art Basel and the Beijing Art Summit in 2019. And I'll let you guys take it from there.
Cool. Thanks, Meredith.
No problem.
Yeah, thank you, Meredith. All right, how are you feeling?
Pretty great.
You're ready to... I thought it might be nice to start the talk with your title about nature is healing, and a little bit about this idea of now that everyone's so excited with the outcome of COVID stopping all this travel and pollution, that nature is coming back, growing, and that it's really good. But maybe if human beings are part of nature, are we then also kind of, in a way, healing ourselves, even though people feel like there's suffering and, of course, there's lots of death? Like, how is this, in a way, good for us, too? Or is it?
Yeah, it's, of course, it's a complex matter. And I think that this title came more from a meme, like people posting these really funny pictures of the Venice canals being clean and cows returning to the sea, and all these like really funny images of animals in urban settings.
And
it is, of course, there is very visible things like the aviation industry that's kind of in a halt right now. People using like their cars and all major like human operations globally are in sort of a pause, and we definitely see very obvious shifts in this sense. And I have been really thinking about like humanity's role in all of this, and how basically this virus seems to be a way that nature has always checked on human beings throughout our history.
What do you mean?
More, as the way I think about it is that the human species is sort of like very ignorant in the way that we position ourselves within the planet, and thinking a little bit about in Greek tragedy terms, it's more like a hubris, and then basically we occasionally, because these kind of pandemics have happened in human history very periodically and very like in multiple occasions, but as generations go by, we kind of tend to forget about that as a possibility. And even though there were clear warning signs, like we kind of chose to ignore them. But then at the same time, humans feel like they have complete dominance over nature, and we often see this dominance in a very like macroscopic level, like seeing how we've basically dominated over the landscape, dominated over other like predatory species and things like that, or like sort of created our settlements. But nature has this other way of balancing populations that is in a more microscopic level, and this is basically the other regulatory system that nature has to balance populations, basically.
Like within the like biodiversity, you mean between
Yes.
species? Okay.
Yeah.
How does that work?
I mean, I'm not a scientist. This is more like from
Tell me
personal
everything.
research and observation, but to me, it's very interesting that the way that this virus works is so much accelerated by the way that our civilization is structured, the way our cities are structured, the way our communication is structured.
Behavior.
It's really accelerated by how our everyday life has been built over the post-industrial society, I guess.
It's kind of amazing. It's kind of mind-blowing. And then this way about nature healing or destroying, maybe both. Let's talk about the work itself, hybrid. When I visitor come and want to interact with this work, what's my interaction? What am I going to see?
Yeah, so I can actually do a quick walkthrough of the online exhibition. So people who haven't had the chance to take a look can get a sense. I'm gonna switch to the website now, and I'm gonna turn the audio on. So this is an online exhibition. Actually, I'm gonna turn it down quite a bit. It's an online exhibition, and it's basically trying to reconsider the way that this kind of like hybrid work of digital and physical works is exhibited online. So here I try to do a very like immersive experience in the form of a regular website where the boundaries between the virtual and the physical are blurred. So I'm gonna scroll through a few of the content here. So we see a few images of the have a longer excerpt from a live simulation piece, also called Ritual, which we can see for a minute or so.
Show this like in a museum or a gallery or something, it would be a single channel projection or on a screen, right?
Yeah, so this is a simulation piece. It's all running in a game engine, and it's happening in real time. And usually the way I will exhibit this kind of work the way that this work is usually exhibited or through a large-scale projection connected to a gaming PC that is running the piece in real time.
Yeah.
So here,
No. So it's not a video. We're not looking at a video of something. It's while you're standing in front of it, the program is running and it's never the same.
exactly. So this is sort of like a video game playing itself. So it will be constantly creating new situations and having things that are controlled by artificial intelligence and are interacting with each other in real time. I will go through some of the details a little bit in a second. Then we have the second part of the show, which is these physical sculptures and tapestry works that were produced and are referencing the similar iconography with the live simulation, but these works were installed in the same location that the live simulation takes place, and we'll talk about this in a second. So this is a modified bird scooter that was assembled from scooter parts that I found in the trash around Los Angeles. This is another view of the simulation. This is a crow's nest that it was built by crows as a decoy to prevent their physical nests to be damaged. This is another view of the physical location. This is a group of ants spelling the word meanwhile. This is a humanoid sculpture that is referencing one of the game engine demos that we'll also talk about in a second. And it's thought of as a sort of like reverse scarecrow that crows build themselves to prevent humans from entering their territory.
Is where the human.
Yeah.
Sorry.
And this is a smaller piece, which is a modified VR headset. Sorry, Mary, I can't hear you very well. Let me turn up my audio a little bit. This is a modified headset that was I found on eBay, and the ad was that this headset was eaten by dogs and it doesn't work anymore. So I got it for really cheap and hollowed it out and installed these miniature sculptures, 2 hyena heads that are basically, as soon as someone would wear this headset, they would really be flashing into their eyes, sort of scaring them. And then lastly, there's these 2 tapestry works that are 2 portraits of the protagonists of the live simulation piece, which are these like really vicious but good-hearted hyenas that are that have somehow bought in bro culture and racing culture, and they are inside this destroyed car and pretending to have a road trip while dancing to music. This is a close-up of the tapestry and a short documentation, short text. This website you can actually visit in slimetech.org/ritual. There's a link to it on the YouTube, so you can take a look later. And we're returning to our Zoom interface here. So yeah, that was a quick overview of the online exhibition.
So let's talk about the characters, because they're all animals. So like we have the ants, and the ants are for you more like the industrious workers, or what are the ants?
Yeah, so I tried to create a sort of ecosystem where these different groups of animals are sometimes competing, but sometimes seem to be collaborating with each other. And they start from a really small scale and go to like the hyenas, which are the biggest ones. Maybe I'll start with the hyenas. The hyenas are
Okay.
these like sort of like nasty, sinister characters, but they also seem, um, yeah, they also are somehow lovable in another way. And hyenas
What is
are,
supposed to be representing the humans? Are they more like us, like kind of
yeah, I
messed
mean, they
up? Or,
definitely are more relatable because they are more like they're mammals and they are definitely more relatable. But one of the ideas is that all of these animals are somehow, in the absence of humans, they are somehow trying to recreate some human behavior, or this is some kind of leftover from the humans' dominance over other species. Uh, but in the absence of humans, some of this behavior remains and either is romantically recreated by these animals or it's more of a reflex behavior.
or it's some kind of residue that human beings left behind, like when Pierre Huyghe in his mask video, like when the monkey just keeps repeating it. Yeah. All right. So it's got like ancient knowledge in it in some way.
Then the second group is the crows that are driving bird scooters and they're racing. There's 3 different scooters racing, and they are basically, and there's an audience of other crows flying around and kind of like following the race as it happens and cheering for different groups. And again, these are sort of influenced by this motocross culture and this culture of like extreme motorsports that often happen in these environments in the California desert, and I assume in other natural environments.
The metaphor for the human beings going through life, like, rushing through life and not even paying attention.
Yeah.
No?
Yeah, exactly. And then lastly, the ants are this like really small scale intervention, but is the only thing that seems a little bit more constructive in this whole simulated ecosystem. The ants are sort of like with patience trying to create these small monuments or performing this small ritual, but within the madness of the whole simulation, this monument is constantly destroyed and they constantly have to recreate it.
I feel like in your work for a while.
Yeah, I think that this piece is meant to be sort of meditative in like when you watch it for a longer duration, and it does have some cycles that happen over time. All these different groups have these overlapping cycles of behaviors. But kind of the intention is to create a sort of meditative feeling within this chaotic ecosystem.
Well, maybe we could talk about the ecosystem, like the idea of this specific work online is kind of innovative and new. There is a little bit of forefathers for work in it, but this site is actually emerging of an actual physical space in a desert somewhere and a found gaming program. Can you how you merge these two places together?
Yeah. So basically, this whole project started from this game engine demo. I've been working with the Unity game engine for a while, and there is a few game engines. For those of you who are not very familiar, the game engines are kind of like the behind the scenes software that video games are created with. And Unity and all these game engines that are competing with each other, each year they release these demos, which are with every year increasingly more complex, and they are usually meant to outline the graphics capabilities of the engine, but as the audience for game engines has become more and more demanding, these demos often feature like a full production house behind them with writers and like really complex narratives that happen. So this particular one was directed by Neil Blomkamp, who is the director of District 9 and Chappie, Elysium, and a few other films, who has been doing pretty interesting stuff with the medium of science fiction, and really like pushing it in interesting directions. But for this particular demo, it struck me like very weird or even suspicious that the game engine company would hire like a really high-level director to direct a short. And then this particular short, it's called Adam Episode 3, if you want to look it up. But basically, this has a very loaded narrative. It has like really complex graphics and 3D animations, but in some ways it feels like it also feels hollow in some ways, as if it's not like really able to escape this demo premise.
It's basically a selling tool.
Yeah. And the other interesting
like H&M using Kate Moss to sell like really cheap clothing.
Yeah.
Is that the correct metaphor?
Yeah, exactly. And then the other interesting thing is that there's a lot of behind the scenes videos of how they made it, because they also want to describe how this is made so other people can hop onto that new workflow. But basically they went into an actual location, which was undisclosed. It is really hard to find where that location is, but that location is this really is this desert location with these very bizarre concrete structures that was all scanned. It was 3D scanned and brought into the game engine as a 3D model. The demo takes place in it, and finally this whole location as a 3D model was released online as a downloadable asset. So what I found interesting as relating to like practices in art history is taking this found 3D environment and using it on the one hand as a found object, and on the other hand as a landscape in more of a land art, in the line art lineage. And how could I intervene or work with this on a landscape scale and on a found object scale.
And then, so how did you integrate the documentation of the physicals that you incorporated into it that was also non-disclosed?
Yeah, so this was the second phase of the project. So after I worked on the live simulation piece and really had a lot of time to be in that space and kind of trying to understand which parts of the physical location got translated and where the production team sort of like shifted things around and added things or removed things or edited this landscape, because it did seem pretty heavily edited in some ways. The next step was making these physical works, uh, making these physical works and then bringing them back to that same location, installing them, and kind of creating this hybrid space where the simulation and the sculptural works are installed, and it becomes very ambiguous as to where this place is and what percentage of it is real and what percentage of it is digital and even fictional.
Yeah, there's a fluidity that's like almost imperceptible to the like normal person's eye. Like I don't know what's coded and what's like a 3D shot, but it's fluid. Like I haven't seen this in anyone else's work, and I find that it's like one of the more interesting things about what you do. That between the VR and the video and the performance and the sculpture, like, it's all in one thing. There is, I mean, is there a feeling for you, like what direction you want to go with this? Like, is it just going to become more like going down the rabbit hole, or what's your sort of?
Yeah.
Where are you going with it?
It is unclear, but it seems like I have this very subliminal, I'm subliminally drawn towards these kind of hybrid representations of space, and really trying to always discover strange ways to merge the physical with the digital. And
I mean, you have no inhibitions about this at all. You're always kind of mixing things together.
Yeah, and I try not to think about it too much, but rather like really attempting experiments and seeing how these two planes merge.
Another thing that's kind of, for me, very interesting about the hybrid is that there's no specific government or nation. You can't see like was it any specific what happened, why there's this post-apocalyptic world there. And then in a way, I feel like because you do that, then it makes like all governments implicit and all like, corporations implicit, where the non-descriptness of it, like anywhere in the mid-latitudes, like is there something specific, like a reason why you're not calling out anyone or having anyone take responsibility for this apocalypse that's like obviously recently just happened?
Yeah, I feel like there is a potential to make more of a universal statement, or make this work be more widely readable, I guess. The history of that actual location is very interesting in itself, and it has really informed a lot of the decisions taken within the project.
What is the history of that specific place?
Yeah, this place was basically this like really beautiful landscape in the desert, which was then industrialized into a large-scale iron mine that had a whole small town that supported it, and its labor force and its infrastructure. It had a train that was going through it, kind of like making sure of the transportation of the iron, and then it had a sort of crisis, and it stopped being an iron mine. Then its school became a prison. There was a prison riot. Then the whole place became completely abandoned. Then it became like a Hollywood film set location where films like Terminator and Transformers and a bunch of other like sci-fi tending films were and scenes were shot. And then this last transformation into game engine demo and a freely available 3D location is really interesting in the lineage of all these transformations that have happened in this landscape.
It's like completely been consumed and consumed and consumed and consumed and consumed until now it's like kind of fighting back in a way. Well, maybe that kind of goes back to your relationship to land art. We were talking about this with all that, the first land art things were like carving out and cutting up and digging up, masculine impulse of destroying the land in order to make land art, and how then, like Nancy Holt and with the Wheatfield in New York, they were a different approach. Like, do you think that your work somehow is going more in a more like female position of additive land art, or what's?
Yeah, there is definitely like some critique of masculinity, and like this particular simulation piece has a very like strong masculine vibe to it, maybe, but
that's kind of in some of your other work as well. It's one of your kind of the continuing threads of interest for you.
Yeah, but then it's definitely there is, I think, this conversation about land art as this like very like grand macho gestures towards the landscape versus a more thoughtful and impermanent take. But also there is a continuity of this conversation into the digitization of the landscape, where there is this whole new level of intervention in the landscape, and this whole conversation about like what happens to the landscape when it's overly photographed by a systematic like satellite network. What happens when like we can go on Google Earth and really scan the whole landscape in a way that is unprecedented, or what happens when we use drones to document and scan physical locations, and in a more traditional sense, this might seem like a completely non-interventional approach, but it definitely brings a different level of intervention or even violence to the landscape.
Something away from it and then using it for something else. But also the site of the demo itself, the Atom Unity game demo, that's a physical, that's a space. Like digital data has material space, and you're taking that and you're also using that. Like there's two sites that are involved that are merged. Like, what does it mean to take that space and use it for something completely different as well?
Yeah, I think it was very interesting for that decision of that demo team to release these assets publicly. Was interesting because this location is super specific, and also this asset is very high end, so it seems kind of impossible that anyone would use it in something else. And that I found like an interesting challenge. And also I found interesting this other layer of transformation, which is having I mean, this studio is not based in Hollywood, but they definitely have this kind of approach where there was a whole concept design team that was sort of building this very dystopian narrative and kind of like wearing it on top of the location and tweaking the location to really communicate that narrative.
Well, maybe also I think this idea that what you're doing is in perceptions, like the way that, you know, Hollywood and movies have been options of, you know, understanding of different cultures in society for 100 years long. Mm-hmm. Inside of Ritual, there's like, you say there's over 50 different like viewing points or cameras. Mm-hmm. So you could basically, if you just let this live simulation run, you could see like 50 different perspectives of that whole space.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
How does that feed into our real life experience?
Yeah, so that's part of the simulation. Like once you have this ecosystem that is running, then there is the question of how do we show this ecosystem. And I basically set up this simple artificial intelligence that is acting as a film director. So the artificial intelligence has this setup of 50 different cameras that are floating inside the scene. Some of them are static, some of them are moving and following some of the actors. Mm-hmm. And then this artificial intelligence has to decide which of the views are the most like exciting ones, or try to keep a certain mood for the whole simulation. And that's also, I think, this question about the viewpoint can lead us a little bit into this discussion about perspective of the audience or of the observer in this piece, which is also important for me whenever I'm creating this kind of work. And sometimes the way that it's set up right now is that sometimes we feel like we are this invisible spectator that is looking through binoculars and trying to understand what the hell these animals are doing there. And at some other times we assume a more bird's eye view or God's eye view, where we feel like we have a better overview of the situation, and then like our point of view is questioned a little bit.
Right, because basically the title of the work is Ritual, and then ritual is pretty much what human beings do, these like repetitive actions to you know, some kind of change in their life and maybe give something up to a higher being, whether it's, you know, some kind of God or something. But in this case, the AI is making these repetitive actions, and the viewer, the other watched being, is us. So does that like machines worshiping us, or is it the reverse, or what's going on with the ritual part of it?
Yeah, so I mean, this
something true.
This part is intentionally left a little bit ambiguous, but it feels like within that simulation there is all these different layers of rituals and behaviors that are happening, and our spectatorship is also part of that ritual, basically.
Yeah, I don't know if I want to be the god of this, like, you know, fucked up AI, really crazy world. It's like the situation we're in now is basically a result of capitalism, and government's gone too far. But if we can really pull it back, it all started with agriculture and religion. So like, how far back do we have to actually pull it to really heal? Like, how far back? What's going to happen with the simulation if it just keeps on running.
Yeah. Yeah, that's the agriculture and religion is really very interesting to think about, and like reading a little bit about uh, like primitivism and thinking about um, very early human societies that were uh, before that. Um, and there's definitely a little bit of that happening in the ritual simulation. Like there is sort of a very primitive um, approach, and there is definitely like technology involved, but the approach to technology is very rough in a sense.
Or are you trying to show us about how our or maybe our hubris, as you were saying in the beginning of the talk, is and lack of faith in something else bigger than us, that we're just getting too entrenched in our own idea of our own power is our own failure, maybe?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Do you want to see if there might be any questions from if we have any viewership? Or I could keep asking questions.
Yeah, we can take a look. Let me also type here. So I don't think there's any questions at the moment, so we can continue potentially. And if any come up, I'll pull them up.
You know what to ask you about, since we have time now, is I love the audio track.
Mm-hmm.
Did you make all that music, or where did it come from? Because we didn't get to talk about that.
Yeah, I mean, the original idea was to have a really long list of like radio stations that the hyenas could listen and tune into, but that seems to be like a licensing nightmare. And I ended up composing this shorter track, and also, I mean, that's something that I always try to really push with this type of work. I think that the audio can have such a huge impact on the perception and the vibe of the piece. And here it's all about creating a complex landscape of sound and having, as these different 50 cameras are navigating this environment, the audio is always dynamic and is always like related to what the camera sees at the moment. So it creates like a fairly complex soundscape out of relatively simple sounds. And a lot of I also like really like kind of voice acting for some of the characters. So
some of those voices are you?
The screams of the crows and the hyenas and like the whispering of the ants and some things like that I recorded myself.
And sorry, if you were gonna say if someone is really obsessed and been thinking about like post-apocalyptic, genres of cinema and books and comic books and stuff for a long time, like what's the next thing after apocalypse? Like we've got so much of it. Like we've got apocalypse porn. It's like coming out of our eyeballs now. What do you think's the next thing after?
Oh, we have a lot of questions here. I'm gonna reply in a second. Yeah, it's I'm very excited about this new genre of apocalypse that seems to be emerging through this situation we're in, which is this more like domestic and pajama-like apocalypse where we are all really in our
Was there a
cozy
meme you were
clothes.
telling me?
Yeah, there's a really interesting meme of Charlize Theron in you've probably seen it in Mad Max 3 with her leather
Oh yeah, looked
outfit.
awesome.
And this is how we imagined we look at the apocalypse, and then another image of her like in the grocery store with her cozy pink pajamas and a cute chihuahua. This is how we actually look in this apocalypse.
Yeah, that's what it really looks like.
And yeah, I definitely think that
It
this
was
kind
like a
of,
level.
and the fact that this whole lockdown and strange situation has been constantly streamed and constantly, like, it became so massive in our social media, sort of really redefining the iconography of the apocalypse. Let me
But it,
let me read
oh
this
yeah, go
question
ahead.
here.
Okay.
So this painter here is curious for painters often seeing themselves as part of some kind of lineage family tree of painters. Are there any particular video artists you aspire to or find more of your inspiration through? Or other forms like video games and films? So that's the first question. Yeah, definitely. I mean, I believe I try to have like a good cohort of artists and also try to stay informed on what like people are doing at the moment, but as in terms of primary or raw inspiration, it comes a lot from internet subcultures and a lot through gaming culture, and it's very exciting to see gaming culture becoming such a like huge part of entertainment, and all the kind of like interesting communities and conversations that have emerged out of that. Second question is, as video art is relatively new art as a medium, what are also the biggest challenges working in this medium? I often hear from my MFA peers of the challenges of selling video art or feeling discouraged because of not knowing how to go about it compared to selling 2D work. How do you sustain life as a video artist? Yeah, that's definitely a hard part of it, but actually having a lineage of video art behind us and having like some of the art market logistics figured out because of the history of video art, I think that there is currently a larger collector base who is willing to take more risks and is willing to invest in these more like sort of precarious forms, but that are, in my opinion, very important at the moment. And there's definitely, I do sometimes feel a pressure to work with more traditional mediums, but I really feel that this medium is really responding to our time, and I feel it would be very like hypocritical to try to avoid it because of that. So I think it's really,
there are a lot of collectors and institutions that are in AI and VR and digital work. I think that there's growing support for that. Yeah. What's the next question?
And there's a third one. Do you also find you have to constantly adapt to new software systems, constantly updating? Um, that's also a tricky part that I've been thinking about, not right now because I feel that now I do have like the sort of um, privilege of time to be constantly looking around and trying to figure out um, technologies that are challenging and interesting. I definitely think a lot about that in sustaining a long-term art practice and thinking of what I'll be doing in 10 or 20 years. And I think it's important to have a consistent sort of critical approach and view towards technology, and then the specifics of the technology or the software is not that important. It's if you have a more conceptual approach towards technology, you can always like uh, find the technology that will communicate or will work for your ideas instead of the other way around.
And speaking about video, film, moving image, and relation to your work, the show you did just previous to this show at Rosen Gallery was at Sundance Film Festival.
Mm-hmm.
So how was it for you to do this, very multimedia kind of performance in this context of film festival and with film audience? Because it was totally different than the art audience.
Yeah, I think that is also like an interesting part about working with this kind of mediums, that they have the potential to reach like multiple different audiences instead of being like very constricted in one specific one. And yeah, also like getting completely different feedback from other audiences, an interesting way to enrich the work. And I think that specifically for Sundance and specifically for a film audience, it's very interesting to think about how filmmakers are really trying to create a universal language and be super communicative and have like reaching a broader audience, whereas in the art world it always feels that there is a tendency towards elitism and towards um, like looking down on art that can actually communicate with a broader audience.
Was the film audience more interested in your narrative, or were they asking more questions about how you made it?
Yeah, definitely. I think, I mean, the question of narrative is really new to me. Like a lot of my work, and also ritual, and specifically, doesn't necessarily have a very straightforward or linear narrative, but is rather, I rather think about it as narrative fragments that the audience needs to piece together to make their own version of it, and it's not necessarily read in one particular way. Whereas I feel sometimes in film there is the kind of like dominant way of working with narrative is a little bit too much of force feeding it to the audience, which I dislike sometimes.
Well, one thing that I've found with a lot of the artists that I'm talking to in different parts of the world right now is that there is an interest in the cycle of histories. I think also with the face of fascism that's coming up all over the world, is people are thinking about like, how can we be here again, and these kinds of cycles. And for me, like watching Ritual felt like you were dealing with the cyclical nature of nature itself and humans at the same time.
Mm-hmm. There is one more question here.
How is AI part in your work that has AI? Like, how do you use? Is that the algorithm of how it repeats, or?
Yeah, I mean, there's very different levels of AI, and like the general conversation right now is more the sort of like cutting edge of AI right now is more like neural networks and sort of systems that are trying to replicate some of the ways that human brain works in a lower level or like in a deeper level. The AIs I work with are generally more like video game AIs that are that you can have a little bit more control over, in the sense of like being more straightforward to work with, and sometimes like giving simpler solutions, basically. I have another question from the audience here.
Yeah.
Humans dominate in increasingly fictional environments. How does digital even sustain in a post-apocalyptic, post-human environment? Will you create physical land art using AI interventions? That's an interesting direction.
Those are some awesome questions. But you do make physical objects, like those sculptures or sculptures. You can go to the gallery and buy them if you want.
Yeah, and it's also, I mean, this sort of like back and forth between the physical and the digital is very important. It's important for me to sort of find ways to translate things from one layer to the other. And yeah, the AI land art interventions sound like a good direction to explore.
Well, maybe if there's no more questions, we should wrap it up. How are you feeling?
Yeah, we are we're hitting our time.
So I want to thank Meredith Rosen not only for showing and working with you, but also for inviting me to speak and for hosting this conversation. Meredith, thank you very much. And Thea, this has been awesome. Thanks a lot.
Yeah.
I'll talk to you soon.
Thank you so much,
when you go to
Thank
My
you
pleasure.
so much for joining. Thanks, online audience, for being here and hitting it off in the chat. Thank you, Meredith, for hosting the show. And feel free to hang in the chat. I will reply to some additional questions that seem to be popping up. But I closed the stream. Cool.
Thank
thanks.
you very much.
Thank you, Mary. That was great.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.